Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Classical Christian Thought. Today, I'll be doing my first Q&A podcast, answering a number of questions that have come in over the last couple of weeks as I put out a request for people to send in their questions. I thought I was going to get to this much sooner, but life just has a way of squeezing out some of these optional plans that I make for myself. As some of my listeners know, I'm a married man. I have a household of 8, so I have 6 children. We homeschool them, and I work a full-time job. My wife is a professional photographer, and there is just never a dull moment here. My children are my treasures, but they do take up a lot of my time. And they come first before any of these, private pursuits that I might have on podcasting or doing videos. So any of those who have sent me messages inquiring on when this podcast was going to actually get released, I do ask for your understanding. But nevertheless, we've got a series of questions here. I have a total of 9 questions that I'm going to attempt to go through, and I'm hoping to do this in a timely manner. I should say, as another preliminary remark, that I have not been able to do the amount of research that I would like to do to answer all of the questions that came in adequately. So there were a couple of questions that I actually had to ignore, and I actually contacted the people who sent in those questions to let them know. But nevertheless, the questions that I do take up here in this podcast, some of them require such detail and extensive elaboration on source material and different, diverse interpretations and scholarship. It's just enormous, and it would be impossible to do within a podcast like this. Nevertheless, people have told me that they benefit from even the tangential aspects of my material, so I'm going to give it a shot. I hope it helps. If not, please leave any questions that remain in the comments section of wherever you might find the link to this podcast. But let's just dive right in. So the first question I have is as follows. Philip Blosser said that the Council of Constantinople 869 is considered an ecumenical council by the Catholic Church. Can we confirm this by manuscript evidence? So the questioner is basically asking is the Council of Constantinople that was held in 869, finished in 870, is that considered an ecumenical council in its own written acts? And the answer to that question is yes. I happen to own the recently released translation into English of the Acts of the Council of Constantinople of 869, 870 by Father Richard Price, who's a well-known, perhaps the most prolific English-speaking historian that comments on the ecumenical councils of the first millennium. I have his translation into English with the commentary, which was accomplished by one of his collaborators named Federico Montanaro, who is a Byzantine historian. I haven't finished it from cover to cover just yet, but I've been able to go through significant portions. And Montanaro himself, I'm not sure what his background is. Sooner or later, I hope to perhaps get in touch with him so I can shoot him some questions that I have about his material, but he doesn't seem to think that the Council of Constantinople 869 is actually officially ecumenical in the consciousness of the popes in the 9th century. So that's an interesting tidbit. If you want to, see more or read more on that, I would recommend getting this book. It's published by Liverpool University Press. It's let's see, it's in the Translated Texts for Historians series, and this is volume 79. So on page 47 of that volume, you'll see some of the comments that Montanaro makes on the ecumenicity of this council. He recognizes that the council itself calls itself, it styles itself, it refers to itself as an ecumenical council. In fact, the 8th ecumenical council, and that's taken from the Latin edition of the Acts produced by Anasthasius Bibliothecarus, or Anasthasius the Librarian for short and easy reference. Anasthasius, in his preface to his Latin edition of the Acts, definitely calls it the 8th Ecumenical Council, and in various sessions of the council, you have the bishops referring to itself as the Ecumenical Council of that they are presiding over. So it definitely claims for itself ecumenicity, but if you dive into the history, not only is there a question as to whether Rome annulled this council 10 years later, it's a moment we shall return to shortly. But there is a question as to whether Hadrian II, who was under whose pontificate the council was convened and adjourned, there's a question as to whether he ratified the council or even referred to it as ecumenical. In the eyes of Montanaro, so this is the latest and greatest work of scholarship on this council. And again, I've not finished my read of the book, but I can give you that slight gloss. All right, so we'll go to the second question. The second question is, does Rome's acceptance of the Council of Constantinople 869, after it had been annulled by the Council of Constantinople 879, prove that Catholicism is false? Did John VIII ratify the 879 Council? Okay, so this is a question that lurks through the internet, especially within the last few years. It has become a hot button item for, especially for Eastern Orthodox interlocutors that, in the Catholic Orthodox dialogues that go on in the internet, as a way to sort of show, hey, Catholicism has contradicted itself on a preeminent dogmatic level. And so, therefore, Catholicism cannot be the true church. The Orthodox Church, rather, is. So this is a question that is one of those questions that I would like to get into in more detail in the future. It would take about 2 hours to really get into enough of the meat to satisfy this kind of question. So what I'm about to give you is extremely tangential, and it's just barely getting to the surface of the issue. But the first point that should be known by all parties is that the content of both of these councils, and from this point on, I'm going to refer to them as the Council of 869 and the Council of 879, just for brevity's sake. And it should be noted too that there's several councils being held in the surrounding decades. So there was a council that was significant in the 850s. There was a significant council in 861 another one in 863, another one in 867, another one in the 870s, 877, and then another preliminary council in Rome in 869 and 870, or 869. But the two councils that are most recalled in the scholarship and the history and in the and just in the general talk of the period is the Council of 869 and the Council of 879 that were met in Constantinople, and which both styled themselves as ecumenical. But let me get back to my first observation here, and that is that the content of both of these councils, 869, 870, does not aim at a doctrinal decree or an anathematization of theological errors or anything like that. So that's significant to keep in mind, because when the questioner is asking whether this phenomena falsifies Catholicism. And well, now we're asking a far more general question, and so we're going to have to find what it is that would falsify Catholicism in this setting, the supposed annulment and then the reverse of that annulment on the Council of 869. So what would falsify Catholicism is a dogmatic stance on a particular doctrine, and then a reversal of that dogmatic stance, a backflip, in other words. And that kind of falsification could not be accomplished in this setting here, because, as I said, there is no dogmatic aim in either of these two councils. Now, some people might say, well, in the Council of Constantinople 869, you have sort of a tackling of a rumored error that was held by the great figure, Photius the Great in the East, that Christ might have had two souls. And my knowledge on that particular item in its theology and the specifics is a bit rusty at the moment. I don't recall if it was another matter regarding the soul of Christ, or if it was that he had two souls. I'm pretty sure it's the latter. Well, the Council of 869 does say that that's an error, and they try to add that to the stacking mount of accusations against Photius in their pursuit to prove the legitimacy of his condemnation. But that's far from being the council's aim. And so even if that council was to ever be abrogated, that would not be an abrogation of that theological item in the council. It would kind of be sort of similar to like the transitus literature in the 3rd and 4th centuries that was later condemned by the popes of Rome. Some of those documents include descriptions of the dormition or the assumption, the bodily assumption of the Virgin Mary. Well, those pieces of literature might be considered spurious or condemned by the Church as spurious, but that doesn't mean that every bit of their contents is thereby being condemned. It's just the authenticity of them is significantly called into question enough to exclude them from even pious ears. So it's similar to this, the issue of the two souls at the Council of 869. But anyhow, wrapping up this first observation is that there is no dogmatic content by which to falsify Catholicism in her acceptance of the 869 Council, then her subsequent acceptance of the Council of 879, and then the subsequent, perhaps, annulment or reversal of acceptance on 879, and then the resuscitation of the acceptance of the Council of 869. Any of those back and forth moves does not run parallel with a back and forth on doctrine. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that the Council of 879 is often understood to be a condemnation of the filioque. And anybody who's done a bit of research on that council couldn't possibly be saying something like that. And if anybody's interested in getting a good grasp of the history surrounding this setting of the Photian synods, as they're called in the scholarship, that's both 869 and 879. I know of no better one in the English than Johann Meyer, whose book is entitled "A Successful Council of Union: A Theological Analysis of the Photian Synod of 879-880." And so if anybody wants to study, get that book. Spend a couple weeks reading it. It was published by the Patriarchal Institute for Patristic Studies in Thessaloniki in 1975. It's extremely hard to find, though. So if your best bet is to look on Bookfinder, but even then, you might have a difficult time finding it. And if it's something that shows up on Abe Books, that's ABE books.com, or Amazon, it might be pricey. I would say it's well worth having a small little garage sale just to get, even if it is a little pricey. The contents are gold. But if you get that book, you'll see that this whole issue of the filioque, the doctrine of the filioque is never even brought up, let alone condemned. The only thing that is remotely close to something nearing the category of the filioque is the horos of the Council of 879, which forbids any word additions to the creed. And it's fair to say that the bishops who drew up that horos had in mind the filioque addition to the creed that had been rumored and witnessed in the Bulgarian mission, where there was to be found Latin missionaries, Frankish missionaries, who recited the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed with the filioque, as they thought was the original stature of the creed, or the original construction of the creed. The Byzantines thought that was obviously wrong. It was a canonical crime against the rule to forbidding any additions to the creed that you find in, say, for example, the seventh canon of the Council of Ephesus 431, as well as in the final session of the Council of Chalcedon, which sort of rehearses that. But the Byzantines at the Council of 879, they are not condemning the filioque doctrine. They are just asserting that the creed cannot have word additions. But even in that horos, the way it's worded implies that an addition to the creed might be possible if the conditions were inviting for that kind of thing. And you can get Meyer's book and read up on that for more of the details. So that would be, the second thing to observe, because, this whole issue of the filioque that came back up in the West, where you've got the filioque in the Creed, you've got the councils of Lyons 1274, the Council of Florence 1439, both putting the filioque into the Creed, at least for Western usage. And that is used as a way to say, hey, look, the Latins contradicted the dogmatic anathema against the filioque from the Council of 879. And that's just simply not the case. So the base for that argument is completely it's completely immaterial. The other thing to keep in mind about this issue of the councils of 869 and 879 is that the well supported tradition of papal supremacy based off of the divine words of Christ to St. Peter as recorded in the Gospels is abundantly testified in both councils. And what I mean by that is the acts of both of these councils, 869 to 870 and then 879 to 880, both of those councils have statements that are just replete with claims to divine supremacy in the Apostolic See of Rome by virtue of nothing else but the divine ordination of Christ over St. Peter to the headship of the church, and symbolized in the verbiage of the keys, binding and loosing, feeding the sheep, and etc., etc. So that's important to keep in mind, because if the Orthodox today are bent on putting 879 in that dogmatic status, that means that all of the contents of that council will also have to be elevated to dogmatic status, which means the divinity of the Petrine primacy as stationed in Rome, because that is what's claimed at the Council of 879. You could read Meyer, and you could read another well-known scholar, Francis Dvornik. He was a stellar Byzantinist historian. Also did studies on Slavic culture, Slavic history, and Bulgaria and other areas in in Eastern Europe. But he's known for his magnum opus, the Photian Schism, Cambridge University Press volume that you must get if you haven't read it, to learn about the Photian synods. Well, Dvornik and Meyer are really the two names you're going to want to get familiar with as you embark upon learning about these Photian councils. And Dvornik documents very well how at the Council of 879, Photius did alter some of the papal letters to reflect what would be more appropriate to Byzantine ears. But even in his pursuit to alter the papal letters that were read aloud at the sessions of the council, the Photius did not alter any of the claims to the divine authority of the Pope. And so that's I can actually read to you an example of a statement that is made aloud in both the Greek and Latin versions of the Acts of the Council of Constantinople 879, as they were reading a section from a letter from Pope John VIII. And let me just briefly tell you what the context is here, so that way, as you're listening to me, you kind of understand what's going on. But it's well known that Pope Nicholas and his immediate successor, Pope Hadrian II, had been of the opinion to depose, or not depose, but condemn Photius of Constantinople. Well, Rome decided to change her mind about that 10 years later due to new information that had been hitherto concealed from the news at the Apostolic See. And so Pope John VIII, whose pontificate is the one that's simultaneous with the Council of Constantinople 879, he basically uses the authority of St. Peter to ratify the reversal of Photius's condemnation, and to ratify his his entrance into the valid office of patriarchate in Constantinople. So this is what he writes in his goal to make sure that this sort of reversal is deemed appropriate in the East. He writes, "Since it has seemed desirable to us to bring peace to the Church of God, we have sent our legates so that they might execute our will, even though in your charity you have already anticipated us in reinstating Photius. We accept this action, which was done not by our own authority, even though we have the power to do it, but in obedience to the apostolic teachings. Since, in fact, we have received the keys of the kingdom of heaven from the high priest, Jesus Christ, by the intermediary of the first of the apostles, to whom the Lord said, I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Everything which you will bind upon the earth will be bound in heaven, and everything that you loose upon the earth will be loosed in heaven. Therefore, this apostolic throne of Rome has the power to bind and to loose, and according to the words of Jeremiah, to uproot and to plant. This is why, by the authority of Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, we announce to you, in union with the whole church, and through you as intermediary, we announce to our dear confreres and concelebrants, the patriarchs of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, and to other bishops and priests, and to all the Church of Constantinople, that we are in agreement with you, or rather in agreement with God, and that we consent to your request, accept this man, Photius, without any hesitation." Close quote. So that's John VIII's appeal to divine supremacy, the binding and loosing powers over the whole church, as it pertained to affairs in Constantinople, to ratify the reinstatement of Photius. And he's trying to write this letter to sort of tell everybody, hey, any of those in the East who might question the reinstatement of Photius, just know that the wielder of the keys has ratified this based upon that power that came through Christ, from Christ through Peter. So that's in the Acts, and there's plenty more to find in the Acts of the Council of 879. So if 879 wants to be shelved in dogmatic status, which, of course, as a Catholic, I'm actually open to discussing, and I think Rome today should very well be open to discussing, then the Orthodox are going to have to be willing to welcome that into their ecclesial consciousness as well, that the divine primacy of the apostolic see, which I don't know could be something that would be done without any essential alteration of Orthodox belief post-schism to the present. So that's the other observation to make about these councils. The other last observation I'll make, but though there could be many more observations to make, is that nobody really held the Council of Constantinople of 879 as ecumenical following its close. What I mean is, in 879 and 880, you had the council closed, but we don't see anybody after that in the immediate history, in the immediate future rather, referring to it as an ecumenical council. And if you pick up Dvornik's book on the Photian Schism, he documents how there are chief voices from Rome and in Constantinople and in other places abroad in the East that continue to count only 7 ecumenical councils. And the Orthodox to this very day don't typically refer to that council as ecumenical, although there are references to it as ecumenical by Orthodox conciliar documents, but it's typically not recognized as one of the great holy and ecumenical councils, which is a significant point, because if this council was to be revered just like the previous seven, it should be unquestionably and profusely referred to as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. But that's not the case. And neither in Rome. Rome continued to count seven only, even well into the 11th century. So, for example, the famous Cardinal Humbert that traveled to Constantinople and is responsible, alongside a couple other legates from Rome, of slapping the bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. He refers to seven ecumenical councils. So this is going all the way to 1053, 1054. This is well after 879. So the ecumenicity of the Council of Constantinople 879 is not abundantly clear, and it's not something that is above discussing. I think that the Orthodox and Catholics who study this issue should be keen to maintain that observation. So that's what I'm going to say about that question for now. I'm sure that more questions about it will flood in as I share this podcast, and I'll try to address those particulars as I can. The next question is, my question is, what's the morality in sharing PDF or downloading movies from torrents? Is a Catholic committing mortal sin if he or she is doing this? Well, I'm not going to claim if any one particular person is committing a mortal sin, because there are subjective conditions to which I'm blind, that would be required for someone's contravention of God's will to be a mortal sin. Catholics know this. You've been trained in catechism class on what a mortal sin is and what it requires. It's not just the objectivity of the act. It also includes whether you have full knowledge of the issue and you give full consent of the will on a grave matter. So I'm not going to say something is a mortal sin for an individual. But what I can say, I can add some thoughts to the first question, which is what about the morality of sharing PDF or downloading movies from torrents? So this is a good question, and I've thought about this for years. I'm a layman, so what I say here is to be taken as the opinion of a layman. I'm not in any place to tell people whether this is right or wrong authoritatively. I'm going to give you my thoughts on the matter, and take it as that, take it with that value. So downloading a movie, I don't know what torrents are, by the way. I'm sad to say. I guess that's like the old school, like, websites where you can. I mean, I'm going back in the day to Kazaa, and some of those places you can go to download things way back in the day. I guess this is something like that. But I would say yes, that's it. That's a form of theft, because that material is owned, and the owner of it is owed a certain price for one's viewing. So I would say downloading movies like that illegally is certainly an act of theft. And with regard to the PDFs, I would also, this is where this gets a little bit more, it gets a little bit more gray, because, certainly if you go to Google and you go to Google Books, you can read sometimes, a huge section of a book, and it's, supposedly, whether permission is given or there is a protection under fair use laws, There is sections of books that you can view without paying for the book, either electronically or physically. You can walk into a library, walk into a bookstore, and look at a page or so. What is discouraged and what cannot be the case is, someone's flagrant reading from beginning to end, and without a purchase of the book. Although, again, that can still be done at local libraries. So this is it is a difficult question to get to. I mean, is the person doing research, and do they just need to look at a section of the book, a page of the book? Do they just need a page number? Do they need a citation from a footnote? What is the purpose of these downloads? That's going to have to be decided by the person who's using these PDFs, and you also have to look at the site that you're downloading these things. Is it a site that has even semi rights to share the material? So those are things I would look into. I would not just get a PDF from some questionable website, read the book from top to bottom. I wouldn't do that. Because that does penetrate into that theft category. Now, someone might say, "Well, I'm going to read it, and if I like it, I'll buy it." Well, I mean, what if I walked into a grocery store and grabbed a gallon of milk and then took it home and we consumed it over the next few days and said, "Well, if I like it, then I'll come back and pay for it." That's or I'll come back and buy another one. That wouldn't work. That's not going to work with books. It's not going to work with movies. It's not going to work with food products. So, but I'm open to hearing anybody's rebuttal to this, and I haven't spoken to every condition. So there are some conditions out there that, but what ifs that somebody might think of that I'm not considering right now. But those are my general thoughts on that question. Bottom line is, try to purchase something fairly, always and every time. The next question is, I would like to hear more about how Rome became the historic seat of Peter instead of Antioch. I know the claims that it was because of his martyrdom there, but that seems like a weak argument. All right, thank you for that question. So this is another area that would require a lot of research and a lot of details that not because there are many details, but because there's not a lot of descriptions of how Peter got to Rome and how the seat of primacy went from Antioch to Rome. But what I can say is this: the chair of primacy that belonged to Peter, that was given to him by Christ, that went wherever his person was. So, if Peter left Antioch, okay, and as tradition tells us, he put Saint Evodius, to rule the Church of Antioch after his departure, the chair of primacy would have stayed with Peter and would have went wherever he left to from Antioch. And Saint Evodius, so while he was definitely ordained as this, by Peter, perhaps, or he's fulfilling the role that Peter had prior, and for that reason he can be called a successor of Peter in some sense. Tradition, hymnographies and liturgical commemorations seem to describe Antioch as the see of Peter in that regard. But the chief seat of primacy that belonged to Peter did not stay in Antioch when Peter left it, because that office is singular. It doesn't belong to a multiplicity of people. It always has to have that singular headship, form and matter. So when Peter left Antioch and went to Rome, so did the station of his chief seat of primacy. And since he left it in Rome, that's where it was picked up. So that's what I would say to that question. All right, so the next question is, does the promise of Christ to Peter entail indefectibility of the papacy? Is the indefectibility of the papacy alluded to by the patristic evidence? How would you articulate the doctrine of indefectibility? How do you justify the corruption of the papacy in the past? How do you justify Pope Francis's relationship with the globalist agenda and movement? Okay, so that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions in one. And of course, this is another one that would require a great deal of hashing topics and categories and concepts that just would require too much time. So I'm going to have to give a short answer to this. So, yes, the promise of Christ to Peter does entail indefectibility of the papacy. And what we mean by the indefectibility is that it cannot have a defect in its function and its usage. So the papacy has a certain function and a usage. It can't defect in a way that would abrogate its status. And so this, we talk about the indefectibility of the whole church. Well, even Protestants recognize that the church, the ecclesia, is indefectible in that sense because they have a doctrine of election, that God's supernatural commitment to His own plan requires that the church is indefectible. In other words, that the mission of the church, the gathering of the elect and the bringing of them from calling to glory, is unstoppable, indefectible. The papacy as an institution is indefectible in the earthly church because we believe that it is the rock of the church, and that the government of the church must retain its hierarchical structure, essentially, until the parousia, or the return of the Lord. So, yes, to the first question. All right, so is the indefectibility of the papacy alluded to by the patristic evidence? I would say yes, and a good example would be at the Council of Ephesus 431, where Philip the legate gets up and speaks about the perpetual divine institution of the papacy. You see this again in Agatho's dogmatic letter that was read aloud at the Council of Constantinople 681, which speaks. It appeals to the famous Petrine texts of the New Testament, the Matthean, the Johannine, and the Lucan passages, which refer to the rock status of Peter, his commission to feed the sheep, and his benefit of Christ's prayer for the strengthening of the brethren. That's abundantly referred to and proven with reference to Rome in Agatho's letter, and which that council accepted as a dogmatic statement of the council. And lastly, it comes up again in the Council of Nicaea too, in the letters of Pope Hadrian to the emperors, which was read aloud at the third session. So yes, the evidence in the ecumenical councils is there, and I would say that indefectibility goes with that. How would you articulate the doctrine of indefectibility? So this is a little bit more complicated. I think we're talking more about papal infallibility. And papal infallibility, contrary to what many people think, is not just a teaching that the Pope is infallible, because that, in a general statement, is not true. The Pope is a person, and he's a human being. And so, insofar as he is a human being, insofar as he is a bishop, and insofar as he is Pope, he is a fallible man. So it's not just enough to be Pope. to be infallible. The Catholic Church teaches that there's a certain set of conditions and actions through which forms an event wherein the Pope is personally infallible, given those constraints and conditions. So that is not a statement to the general infallibility of the person of the Pope. That's much rather speaking of the infallibility of the Pope in a certain event, given certain actions and conditions. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about papal infallibility. It's kind of similar to how some of the Orthodox might refer to the infallibility of an ecumenical council. So a council is a group of bishops. Now, are bishops all infallible? Well, the Orthodox might say no. The Catholic Church has a more nuanced answer to that question. For that, you can read Lumen Gentium in one of the chief texts of the Second Vatican Council. But the Orthodox probably would say that the bishops are fallible individually, and just because you put them all in a group doesn't turn them to be infallible de facto or ipso facto. But the event of the council, because the Holy Spirit presides over the council and the patriarchs, that there's this orchestra where heaven and earth meet together, and you have this protection of the council. That would be speaking to the infallibility of persons in a certain event with certain actions and conditions that are in operation. So the infallibility of the papacy would be in the same manner. It's conditional to a certain act and a certain event. And so if we're going to be testing whether the papacy has been indefectible or infallible in its dogmatic utterances, you'll have to narrow down the teaching of the papacy to those dogmatic utterances to see if there has been, an error that could be detected. So the next question, the question, that one question continues. How do you justify the corruption of the papacy in the past? Well, we certainly don't want to justify the corruption as if, to declare it actually good or, make it right in some way. What the question, I think, is saying is how to explain the corruptions of the papacy and still maintain the truth of the papacy. And, the answer to this question is that Christ, when he formed the government of the church, he did so with sinners. And because of that, they have an enormous capacity for erring. So even within the apostles, Peter had a lapse in Antioch. I'm sure Paul may have been accused at times for small mistakes. Certainly Silas and him had a disagreement, as recorded by St. Luke. We see the other apostles sometimes making some foolish statements when they're in the presence of our Lord. We see in the early churches that mistakes are made, scandals arise, bad bishops come into office, bad popes come into office, and some of this can, wreak havoc on the church in many ways. For some reason, just like God has allowed evil in the general scope of the created order, he has also been pleased to allow a capacity for evil in the ecclesial order and even within the papal order. And why has he allowed that? Why has he not simply made it impossible for a pope to be a sinner, or impossible for there to be great scandal from the apostolic see? I don't know. I don't know. I can only give you what was believed about Rome. And some of these more existential questions may be unanswerable, but that doesn't subtract from the attestation of the papacy in from Scripture, from the Fathers, from the councils, from the consensus of the Fathers and of the Church. So if you have all those in the direction of a papacy, but then you have these more existential questions about the capacity of papal corruption and how that coheres with the ultimate telos, or the ultimate end of the papacy as a principle of unity. Well, now we're getting closer to the echelon of asking questions like, why does God just sit there and allow certain unimaginable evils to happen to uh, persons who are otherwise innocent with regard to a certain context? Um, and and some of these examples we could fathom really challenge theism. But I think as theists we can kind of but we have to kind of reach a point where, yeah, come up with whatever crazy example you want. Um, this still doesn't undo the truth of theism. Now, in the case of the papal order, there is a falsification criteria, which would be that the Pope stands up and issues a dogmatic stance, a dogmatic utterance, and just utterly misleads the whole church against Christ through the belief of an error that would compromise our salvation. That would be a falsification criteria, at which time I would have to, humbly, courageously hang my hat as a Catholic apologist and continue seeking the truth in prayer and in fasting. The last part of the question is, how do you justify Pope Francis's relationship with the globalist agenda and movement? Whew. So this is another one. um, we have to be very careful what we're intercepting from the media. Now, trust me, I'm not trying to be, another one of those French fry commentator that just says that the media is what's mislabeling Pope Francis or misconstruing Pope Francis. We don't want to go that route. We've done that, tried that, and failed too many times for it to be a viable explanation. So it does seem that Pope Francis has a keen interest on cooperating with globalist agenda figures. So that's undeniable. On the other hand, he himself has been vocal against the abortion. He's been extremely pro-life from conception to natural death. He's also ratified a document from the Vatican that basically condemned the blessing of same-sex couples. So, in other words, he's not for population control. He's made comments on the need for families to have more children. So, which house are we considering here? Are we just looking at the complaints of the trads, for which I sympathize the most? Or are we ignoring the fact that the liberals are also quite upset with Pope Francis for his inability to just come out and allow women deacons, for example, or his allowance for same-sex couples to be blessed by priests, or the open allowance of adultery and remarriage. Amoris Laetitia reiterates the ban on communion for those in mortal sin, and it does reiterate the fact that um, second, there are no second marriages while the real spouse is alive. So none of those things budged. However much the pastoral praxis on a subjective level uh, was altered in the 8th chapter of Amoris. But what I'm trying to say here is that we've got to hold our horses a little bit. Yes, there's some concerning things that the Pope is doing with these world leaders and these globalist agenda figures. But at the same time, we also see this other aspect that completely goes against that narrative. So, which one do we believe? Do we distrust one in order to believe that he's just, a pure globalist, or do we distrust that and take him at his word as a pro-life Catholic? It's difficult to say, and the evidence is just not enough for us to be right in making a judgment on that. So that's what I would say about Pope Francis. There's so much more to say, but I should stop before I say something I regret. All right, the next question is, if you could please give us the basics of Eastern Orthodox views regarding a bishop's primacy of jurisdiction above other bishops. I understand there is not one unified answer among the Orthodox on this matter, so it would really be great for you to give us an idiot's guide on it. Also, I would love to know what, in your opinion, is the best argument against Vatican I's view of the papacy from an Orthodox side, and why you think it still isn't enough to convince you. Okay, so I am not Orthodox, so I cannot answer this question with any claim to reliability. But what I can do for you is recommend some of the experts who are Eastern Orthodox. So one book that I recommend to learn more about the understanding of primacy in Orthodoxy is called Primacy and Conciliarity by Professor Louis Patsavos. That's Patsavos. He is a professor of canon law at Hellenic College. Small little booklet. You could probably finish it in a day. But that would be on the side of high primacy, believing that Orthodox ecclesiology allows for a high primacy of the Bishop of Constantinople, which basically displaces the former role of older Rome in the first millennium. So that you have that position, and it seems to be allowable within Orthodoxy. On the other side of the spectrum, you might want to look at the Russian Orthodox Church's response to the Ravenna meeting in 2007. And so here I'm referring to some of the several statements of the ROC, the Russian Orthodox Church, and Metropolitan Hilarion of Olacolomos, who has been sort of a mouthpiece for Patriarch Kirill for many years. Some of his reactions against the Ravenna documents from 2007, which spoke about a universal office of primacy without defining its prerogatives. Well, Russia even had a problem with that, let alone whether that primate had any prerogatives specific, to canons and jurisdictional procedure. So I would look into that. Just Google that. You can find all kinds of documents. Another thing you want to read is probably another on the high side of primacy view is Reverend Emmanuel Klapsis, Clapsis. He wrote an article entitled Papal Primacy. And if you just type in his name, Papal Primacy, the Greek Archdiocese of America will have that article for free for you to read. And obviously look at Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, a man whose reputation should be lauded, I think, for his scholarly material. Kallistos Ware's classic book, The Orthodox Church, has a section on primacy that I think is short enough for any listener to get their hands on, and sort of get the basics. But an idiot's guide, this is kind of hard to do. But the Orthodox definitely hold to a synodal structure of ecclesiology where you've got local churches that are all under a bishop, and that bishop is in collaboration with other bishops under and within a synodal organization, which has itself a head called the metropolitan, and then in larger structures, the patriarch. And those offices do have canonical rights. So they're not just, primacies of honor in the sense that these are just, honorific figures because their name gets put at the top of every list, or they get to preside at divine liturgy whenever they're present. No, they do have canonical teeth, and they can enforce certain procedures by the force of canonical law. So that's that's definitely kind of the over the bird's eye view there. That canon law is what's supreme, and canon law legislates the hierarchy of deacons, presbyters, and bishops, and then over bishops you've got metropolitans in the synodal structure, and then in other places you've got the patriarchal synodal head over a plurality of metropolia, and they all have got they can all appeal to the rights and the privileges that are afforded to them by the canons. And so this, they kind of look at the canonical structure and the canonical organization of the hierarchy as kind of like the locus of legitimacy of how to conduct primacy, appeals, and what have you. All right, so the next part of that question was, what is, in your opinion, the best argument against Vatican I's view of the papacy from the Orthodox side, and why do you think it still isn't enough to convince you? Well, there's a lot to say here, but I'll just kind of give you a zinger. The views of the universal primate in the first millennium, being in the office of St. Peter in Rome, it had a totally different understanding of itself in terms of origin and in terms of its legitimacy. I would say that the claims to its origin in the transaction between Christ and Peter, it's far too well attested to ignore. And so the universal primacy of Peter has to be of divine institution. And I say transaction between Jesus and Peter. What I mean is Peter's confession of faith, and then Christ's return to that with the bestowal of the keys of the kingdom and the adornment of Peter as the rock of the church, and put in that position of authority. This primacy is not originating in canonical law or canonical procedure. That's of Christic origin or dominical origin from the Lord. And so that cannot be erased, Now, are there canons and councils in the first millennium dealing with certain procedural law and attributes about papal primacy? Yes, absolutely. And those are to be followed. But that doesn't mean the papacy itself is canonically created. Just like the episcopate is not canonically created, but can still be regulated by canons. So also the same with the papal office. So I would say that Orthodoxy's rejection of primacy, of the Petrine primacy over the whole globe, over the world, specifically with reference to the origin in Christ and Peter, that is denied by the Orthodox Church. I think that kind of already makes too much of an inequality between contemporary Orthodox theories on primacy and the first millennium theory on the Roman primacy. If they were somewhere in the near vicinity to each other, I think the Orthodox might have an argument for their case. But they're just they're worlds apart, in other words. And you could see this in the scholarship today, even Father Richard Price, but this also comes up in scholars like even Metropolitan Hilarion, Father Alexander Schmemann, and other Orthodox ecclesiologists who all recognize that in the East and the West, you had this kind of developing separation between East and West on what they understand about the Church. So two distinct ecclesiologies. Some people have said. Now, I don't go so far as to say that, but there's definitely something to be gleaned from the differences between the Greeks and the Latins at significant points in the first millennium. All right, so the next question is, do you think we have ex cathedra papal pronouncements in the first millennium? And if so, which specific statements, in your opinion, could be qualified and why to ex cathedra, irreformable level of papal teaching? So this is a famous question. Protestants and Orthodox are wont to say there's no infallible list of infallible statements. So the resourcefulness of this claim to infallibility sort of gets limited by the fact that not everybody has the same pool of statements to work with. And so to answer the question, I think yes, in the early church you do have papal. I would say, for example, the Tractoria of Pope Zosimus is basically a decree of Pope Zosimus in 419 condemning Pelagianism. I think his predecessor's decree condemning Pelagianism, Pope Innocent I, could qualify as an ex cathedra teaching. I think that Pope Leo the Great's tome on the two wills of Christ and his one person, that would be an ex cathedra statement. Agatho's letter read aloud at the Sixth Council, that's definitely ex cathedra. One could say that Pope Hadrian's defense of the images in his letter to the emperors, read aloud in the third session at Nicaea II, is ex cathedra. I think his predecessor, Pope Gregory II, might have done something similar to that. That could be considered ex cathedra. You'll have to research that one. I'm not positive at the moment on that specific one. There were several widespread decretals that were shared from Rome that could be said to have certain ex cathedra elements that I don't have in front of me with a list, but some theologians have counted many ex cathedra statements. Those who say there's been only two, I think it's a rare position to have, but in recent decades, more and more people have generally got the idea that there's only been two with regard to the Immaculate Conception and the bodily Assumption of Mary. But that's just simply not the case. It's just unworkable that such a gift like that would be given to the Church just to be ignored and dormant for 19 centuries. It's just an untenable position. So that's what I would say to that. So the next question is, the authority of the Church to institute the practice of communion in one kind, is this a valid development? So this is the Catholic Church's practice that was there for quite a long time, to obviously confect the Eucharist in both the elements of bread and wine, but in the reception of the faithful, giving it in both kinds was not only it was not only not done, it was forbidden. And so the laity could only receive in the species of bread, in the consecrated bread, the body of Christ. Of course, the Catholic Church had always believed that in the consecrated bread you have the whole fullness of Christ, the total Christ. So body, blood, soul, and divinity in both species and both kinds. So is this a legitimate development? Well, we have to back up and ask, when Christ said, "Do this in memory of me," subsequent to him saying, "Take all of you and eat," or "Take all of you and drink," does he intend by this to create a precept, an imperative precept that a command that you have to receive in both kinds, specifically to that constitution of both kinds, such that having only one kind would be to produce a sin against the precept of Christ? The church did not take that position, I don't think, ever. And I think there's early attestation of infants only receiving the blood of Christ, for example. I think that there's some examples, and I'm speaking off the cuff here, so I'll try to get some references to this. But if I cannot produce this, you're just going to have to go look this up and do some research, and some scholarly volumes on early liturgical practices you might get from like Cambridge or Routledge or some of these other publishing centers. But when deacons used to deliver the Eucharist to saints that were behind bars, the martyrs, they would not bring both kinds. They would usually bring the consecrated bread. And so that was a reception in one kind. You have you do have instances where the early fathers seem to make it clear that both kinds are appropriate. For one pope, Gelasius, seems to speak against an error that was brewing in the West, where somebody was forbidding reception in one kind over the other for some weird reason. And Pope Gelasius said, no, that would be sacrilegious to receive only in one kind in that manner. But again, that's speaking to a specific context where the ideas of forbidding both kinds is synonymous, or it's intersectional with Gelasius's condemnation. So we can't just use Gelasius's statements there as a condemnation of the later Latin development on of forbidding the consecrated wine. So we have to say that it's not a sin against the precept for this to be the case. There, you can receive in one kind legitimately, and if you do so, you receive the whole full Christ. And so, if we take those realities together, whatever kind of reform this was, whether it was an imprudent one, which I don't think we can say, but let's just say, for example, if it was an imprudent development, or if it was the development that was for the greater good, in either case, we don't have a sin against any of Christ's precepts, for which somebody might accuse the Catholic Church and say, hey, you're one of those that has now taught these little ones not to obey the commands of Christ. That would not be the case. That would not be the case. It's not a sin against the precept. However, I would say that the sacrament has its full expression in the reception of bread and of the consecrated bread and the consecrated wine. And the Catholic Church, don't get me wrong, does recognize the necessity of that expression, because the priest has to consecrate both kinds to make it a valid and legitimate sacrament. And he has to consume the bread, the consecrated bread and the consecrated wine, both the body and blood of Christ. But the question is, when it starts to be distributed to the faithful, I do think that the full sacramental expression is seen in the consumption of both kinds. And I think that to limit that was a mistake, in my opinion. But can it be considered legitimate? Of course, I think it is. If you go into the early centuries of the church, you have a variety of liturgical practices that are going on, which did not get consolidated until a lengthy time had passed. So, for example, we have the liturgical tradition or the apostolic tradition of Saint Hippolytus. I know some scholars dispute over whether it was Hippolytus who wrote it, but I'm of the opinion that he did, and that it was a widely circulating paradigmatic set of instructions on how to receive people into the church, how to ordain certain ministers, and other elements of the early liturgical practice of the church. But in that apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, he talks about how he seems to speak about young children getting baptized. And, but you could tell that the liturgy of baptisms catered for confessing adults. And if you pick up a work by Everett Ferguson on baptism in the early church, he'll give you several citations where infant baptism was not the universal norm in the early church across East and West. You had many people who were, putting it off till they were older, and certain saints like Basil the Great, John Chrysostom, I want to say the two Gregories, Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine. These were all people who were brought up in a Christian context in their home, but were not baptized until they were older. And so and that's, we're going from North Africa to Cappadocia all the way to, the farther east, Antioch and Constantinople. So it seems as though infant baptism was not like it is today in canon law for either Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Saint Gregory, I want to say Saint Gregory of Nazianzus. It was him or Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who said that he recommended that a child be 3 or 4 years old before they're baptized. And his reasoning is that they could understand what's happening. Now, I know that's going to, some of my Orthodox, Catholic, and Presbyterian and Anglican and Lutheran listeners are going to perk up here, but I actually have an article on my website that details his position on this. If you go to ericybarr.org, type in Gregory infant baptism, probably the first article that'll come up will give you the details on that. So, but a theologian of his caliber could not possibly say that if infant baptism was the solid and just this pattern that was universal everywhere. Tertullian, North African, in the writing in the latter part of the 2nd century, dies in the beginning of the or not the beginning, but kind of into the 3rd century. He's totally against infant baptism, and he doesn't think that it's ineffective. He thinks it's effective, but he thinks it's dangerous because of its effectiveness. He thinks that giving the infant the remission of sins is going to endanger him as he goes through years of passion when they get older, where they might abrogate that baptismal innocence and then sort of jeopardize their chance to return to the church. But in any case, what I'm trying to say here is that the baptismal sacrament had not always been uniform and always the same with regard to the recipients as to their infancy or their adolescence or even their adulthood. And so the church can modify the sacraments because the church has the authority. She has the custody of the sacraments. Not to get rid of them, she cannot do that, but certainly to find what's essential to them and modify accordingly certain accidents to the sacraments. And same with regard to infant communion, I would say. Infant communion and adult communion. In the Catholic Church of the West, they began to distribute communion only to children who were at least 7 years old, confirmation and the Eucharist. Whereas the East continued to do all three, the tri-ritual of baptism, chrismation, and the Eucharist in one sacrament. Although they knew that there was a difference between the three. But like I said, that was not always uniform simply because in the earliest centuries of the church, even infant baptism wasn't the absolute norm. And so if infant baptism was not the absolute norm in early Christianity, then also infant communion was not always the norm either. So you do have some developments taking place in the early centuries of the church. The church did consolidate upon what the Orthodox do today. That was basically what the church in the West did up until the 11th century, at which time, for various circumstances, the sacraments were kind of separated. And the Latins justified this theologically. Baptism, it gives you sanctifying grace and a citizenship in heaven, and you can't abrogate that until you have the use of your intellect and will to turn away from God. Anyway, so all baptized infants until they're of the age of reason to utilize the will against God, they're citizens of heaven, and if they die, they're going to heaven infallibly. That's a good defense. At least, it saves the Latin practice from being detrimental, to the salvation of our kids. All right, let me move on. There's so much more to say about that, but time is getting. I'm at here at an hour and 22 minutes already. All right, let me take a sip of water. All right, last question is, does your book on Melchizedek take a more Roman Catholic approach to the priesthood, or is it compatible with the Eastern understanding of priesthood sacrifice? Like, would Orthodox and Eastern Catholics be open to reading, studying from your book? So the answer to this question is my book on Melchizedek and the Last Supper is definitely for the Eastern readers, Byzantine, Oriental, or Assyrian, Ethiopic, wherever, Syriac. It's for everybody who believes that the Eucharist is a sacrificial offer, and that it's rooted in the Melchizedekian typology of Genesis and the Psalms, as fulfilled in the writings of, as we get testification in Hebrews. That is for everybody. It's not some corner of Latin theology or for the Roman ritual only. All right, so that answers those questions that came in. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share it abroad with anybody you know who might benefit from it. And I invite any of your criticisms, critiques, further questions, or in Any capacity you would like to correct me, I am open for correction. I just ask that you would do it in a spirit of charity and to follow the golden rule of Christ, which is to do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. God bless you.